kick off our event, I'm thrilled to introduce Nicholas Brandt, who's going to turn us all into busy novel writing bees. As a member of our LA Network Leadership Council, Nicholas Brandt, class of 1998, is originally from Tonawanda, New York. His produced filmography includes Hollywood Kills, The Secret Life of Dorks, and Bad Behavior. In addition to his film work, his graphic novel with artist Scott Arnold, Joshua Jace, Minimum Wage Henchman, was released in 2019 through Comixology and printed by publisher Comic Mix. In partnership with Laura Watkins on music and lyrics, Brandt also wrote the books behind Comic-Con the Musical and Glass Ceilings. Nick, we don't know where you found the time to help us all get writing between all of your own creative projects, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for that introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to jump right into the presentation because, that's what you're here for. And then hopefully in a little bit, we'll have some questions to go with. So if this is not appearing for everybody, somebody give me a shout out. Are we good?
I can see it.
Cool. So I wanted to do this to kick off National Novel Writing Month, NaNoWriMo. And I'm just calling this a primer because you have a month starting on a Monday. So let's go. Today, I wanted to try to give you just a brief overview of some of the thoughts that I've had and some of the process and some of the considerations that you should have. So 3 parts: inspiration, information, and considerations, because I like things that sound alike. So this is some of what writing is: reading, listening, observing, percolating, rewriting, finishing, or that great acronym WRLAPROF, which no one will remember. So writing is living. If you're a writer, everything that you take in is part of the process. And we'll go a little more into that later on, but I just wanted to kick it off with you to start thinking in terms of how you are a writer every day, every moment of the day. I've spotlighted some quotes from some authors I like. So this is from Margaret Atwood. Hopefully y'all know who she is. You most likely need a thesaurus, a rudimentary grammar book, and a grip on reality. The latter means there's no free lunch. Writing is work. It's also gambling. So kind of a good start to what we're doing. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about math. I know math isn't normally something that you think of when you're thinking about writing, but it's all about building blocks. And so if you write 50 words, that's a paragraph. 400 words is a page. 300 pages is a manuscript. Now, it doesn't have to be 300 pages. That's pretty lengthy manuscript. We're not going to necessarily aim for that all the time, but it's a good target to think about writing something that has a bit of length to it. And we'll talk a little bit about that math on the next slide. But writing every day, that's not always something that somebody can do, but you should make that your goal because you want to flex that muscle whenever possible. Edit and rewriting is more important than the actual writing. Get your writing seen, because some things that will sound or seem natural to you will be a blocking point for somebody as a reader. So you want to make sure that you're getting that feedback. Rejection is part of the creative process. Trust me, I've been rejected a lot. I always say that high school was my primer for being a creative. And then reading. The best way to improve your writing is to understand what you like and what works from some of the writers that you admire. So there are 30 days in November, and a novel is technically 60,000 words. That can shift depending on what you're looking at and what genre you are, but that's a good roundabout number. So if you divide 60,000 by 30, and I checked this on a calculator just in case, that's 2,000 words a day. That's doable. Is it necessarily going to be your normal starting pace? Probably not. I'll have days where I write 500 and I'm happy. I have days when I write 3,000 and I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened? So it's just a roundabout target. But if you're really aiming to get that 60,000 words, that's the pace you'd have to keep. Talking a little bit about genre, you should know going in what genre you plan on writing with, and make sure that you're familiar with the trappings and the tropes and what's the expectation for somebody reading that genre. This is just a list of some of them, but it depends on what you want to write. So a children's book is obviously going to be much shorter than a magical realism book. Children's book could be like 50 pages. And honestly, if you're looking to write that, that's a great starting point, because writing a book is the same whether it's a very long book or a very short book. You still have to go with that beginning, middle, and end. So it's good to kind of take a bite on something that might be a little more achievable if this is your first time writing a novel. Also love Stephen King, so I'm going to give you another quote here. Description begins in the writer's imagination, but it should finish in the reader's. So that's something to consider. Your words are planting a roadmap, and it's different from other forms of writing, because I'm also a screenwriter by nature, and screenplays are a blueprint. They're ultimately meant to be filmed. So that's going to be interpreted by that one single camera and the editing process. However, with a book, you are going to be seen through the filter of your reader. So always keep that in mind. And this is a little bit more on genre. You can see that even within genres, there are subgenres, and you can also mix and match. It could be like a space opera romance, you know, find that niche where you feel like your voice will be most present, and voice is important. That's what separates you from other writers. Some additional considerations include story, characters, tone, and theme. Story, simple story, character plus want plus obstacle. What is it that your character wants and what stands in the way? That obstacle will create the journey. And if you're familiar with the hero's journey, that's also something that's a great archetypical, yeah, sure, we'll say that, way to like see what someone will go through to go from the beginning of their journey to the end. And there's a lot of elements that you can deploy from that, even if you're not necessarily writing something that would traditionally fit with that. The hero's journey obviously is a big inspiration for things like Star Wars. And I'm sure you can align it to something like a Harry Potter or anything like that. So character, I like to think of them as everyone you've ever met that's stuck inside your brain. And that's how you should approach characters, because the more specific, the more detail you give, the more rich their life will be inside the reader's brain. Tone is something that you should also consider, and that's the feeling that you're providing. Obviously, if you're writing something that's humorous, you should have a humorous feel. If you're writing something that's scary, somebody should be afraid to turn the page. And then if you're writing it well enough, they'll still turn the page, because that's what you're doing, is you're pushing them along, because they now know your character. They know what the character wants, and they want to see how the character is able to get it, if the character is able to get it. And then theme, the message that you provide your reader. Some people will enter the writing process knowing their theme, and some people will find it when going on the journey. That's completely going to be part of your process, and it's going to depend on how you work. We'll get to a little bit of that in a bit. Language is the laughter of the soul, Pablo Neruda. We're all given this opportunity to write and explore these worlds, and to share them ultimately by writing them down for other people. This is a great opportunity for you to try your hand at that. And that's why I really wanted to be part of this NaNoWriMo kickoff thing. So now, who are your readers? So that's twofold in my consideration, additional considerations. Your audience, what demographic are you writing for? Obviously, if you're writing for children, that's going to be a different approach to tone, theme, word usage, character journey. All of that's going to be different than if you're writing a gothic horror, which will be a completely different audience. You're probably not going to get too many 7-year-olds picking that up. A, because it'll be, pretty lengthy, and then B, the audience isn't the right thing. And then format. What are you hoping for, and what can you accomplish? Obviously, there's the traditional publishing, there's self-publishing, and there's digital. If you finish a book, there is a way for you to get it out. It may be that you put it out yourself, or you might try the process of going through a publisher, which would require an agent and an editor. And obviously, if you're self-publishing, you should also make sure that you have a good editor on board. So now let's go into the writing process. I always start with what if. I think that is when people ask me, where do you come up with stories? It always starts with what if. And I'm going to give you an example of that, because that's my dog. And there's a point at which my wife swore she heard my dog say woof, not to actually make a dog word, but to actually say woof. And that got me thinking, what if my dog wasn't really a dog? What if my dog was something else and they were here for a reason other that I didn't know? And that led to me coming up with the idea for my novel Empowered, wherein this friendly guy takes in what he thinks is a dog, but it's really an imp that's after his soul. You know, so a real random like what if jaunt, but you can see how the wheels were turning. Apply what if in your life, and what if can be applied to almost any story. Like think about a story that you love and figure out what the what if kernel of it was, and then try to figure out how to apply that kernel to your own questions. Write what you know, drinking tea. Everybody's seen a dragon probably at this point, not in real life, but in film, TV, or in a book. But the more specific your dragon is, the more interesting it is. So if your dragon has all of the traits of your great aunt Ida, and is a big fan of tea, that makes it a dragon that we maybe haven't seen before. So think about how you can take the elements of your life and your experiences and the people that you know and apply them into your fiction. And I think sometimes people hear that phrase, write what you know, and they're like, okay, well, you know, I'm a fence builder, so I guess I'm going to write a novel about fence building. That's not necessarily what the idea behind that is. As a fence builder, you might have some really interesting characters that you work around. Now take them and put them into a different situation, and you're still writing what you know, but you don't have to write a novel about fence building. And here we go, another quote. This is from Shirley Jackson. I'm hoping that you're familiar with some of these authors that we're using. A writer who is serious and economical can store away small fragments of ideas and even events and conversations and even facial expressions and mannerism and use them all someday. And you are constantly compiling this information. Every single person you meet goes into that mental Rolodex, and you can pull that up when you need that. So a writer has two hands, hopefully, usually. A writer has 2 eyes and 2 mouths, generally. Writer, 2 eyes and 2 ears, 1 mouth. So what does that say? You should be observing. You should be listening. When you're talking, you're not really doing either of those things. Your talking will come out when you're writing. So be mindful of your world and really appreciate what you see around you, because the details are what's going to really sell something, especially if it's fantastical. It's the details that are going to create the world that the reader is going to live in. Another part of the writing process is pantsers versus plotters. And I tend to be a pantser when I'm writing screenplays, but I'm more of a plotter when I'm writing fiction, novel type work. The nice thing about these things, pantsers, it's considered fun. It's chaotic. It's the joy of discovery. And then plotting, organized. Some people call it stifling, but it provides a clearer path. The writing process is going to be different from everybody, and you should find out what works best for you. A plotter will have a better roadmap, but there's still a lot of discovery that can happen there, especially if you only plot like the major 5 structural points of your work and then figure out how to get from one to the other. Pantsing can be a little dangerous when you're novel writing, just because you're not entirely sure where it's going and how long that journey will take. And what you don't want to do is invest a lot of time in something that's going to end up not being worth the time invested. The idea is not the thing. A lot of people will be like, oh, I have this great idea. That's great. That probably can take like 5 to 10 seconds for you to tell somebody that idea, but that's not a book. That's not something that somebody can like hold and enjoy the journey of. You need to put it to the page. And that's sometimes tough, but in order to be a writer, you have to write. You are building a bridge with your story. And that means beginning, middle, and end. That means you have the journey, you have the character, you have the want, you have the obstacle. But the nice thing is, you are not a bridge builder. So if there is a moment where you're like, oh, I don't know what happens next, but I know what happens here, use that. Do pebbles, because nobody has to, when you're in the writing process, walk across that bridge. If you know what's happening towards the end, you can write that down, put that down, so that can inspire what's happening before it. So always write what you're feeling in that moment. Don't ever feel like you have to literally start on page 1 and end on page 200. If you know that there's a big beat later on that you are very firmly grasping in your mind, put that down on the page. It's a way to not have the editor get in the way of your process. Procrastination is part of the process. In addition to all of the observation that you're doing, when you're not writing, you're still writing. The only problem is procrastination. If it becomes the process, you're no longer a writer, you're a procrastinator. But a lot of the time you're going to be possibly stuck on an idea or something. So you need to let that percolate in the back of your head. And that's totally fine. That's part of the process. It just can't be the entirety of the process. Because you can't reach your destination if you keep retracing your steps. And this is a lot about the editor. And the editor is kind of the enemy. Perfection is the enemy of done. If I literally, I will keep the thesaurus page up on my computer because periodically I'll be like, that's not the right word, and I want to switch it out really quick. If you taking the time to discover the right word becomes more of the writing process than it is propelling the story forward, you're falling into the pit of the editor. And the editor is great for revision, but when you're writing, you need to try to turn the editor off and get to the end, because when you get to the end, you can then reflexively look back on everything and be like, oh, maybe that character shouldn't do or say this, or shouldn't look like this. Maybe I need to refine that because now I know the full scope of everything. So do not let the editor get in the way of the end, because when you reach the end, that's when the writing happens. Big fan of Douglas Adams. I actually saw him speak at the University of Rochester. Let's think the unthinkable, let's do the undoable. Let us prepare to grapple with the ineffable itself and see if we may not F it after all. And that's the process. You have to get to the inspiration and then put it down on the page. And then once you've gotten to the end, that's when the rewriting begins. And that's where you have to do a lot more of the work. Try to approach the initial writing process as a joyous thing, as a fun thing, because the real work should happen in a revision, because that's when you know what you need to know and when it all needs to happen. So turn the editor off whenever possible during the writing process. Bring the editor back up when you're revising. And the nice thing is, and I heard this, a writer say this, and I wish I remember who said it, and I don't. This is not me, this is somebody else. You'll never write alone because you are writing with future versions of yourself. If you today, Saturday, can't handle that problem, maybe you Sunday can, maybe you Monday can, maybe you a week from now can. You're never writing alone because future you is looking out for those problems. So always feel like if you can't solve it today, there's a future version of yourself that'll be able to solve it. Also, you shouldn't write alone, especially when you have something to show. You need to be able to share it with other people, and you need to accept feedback, and you need to decide whether that feedback is helpful or not, and figure out the people who give you helpful feedback and rely on them. If somebody is giving you a sticking point and somebody else gives you the same sticking point, that's a sticking point, whether you agree with it or not. And they might not have the solution that you need to deploy to fix it, but you know that there needs to be a fix deployed there. So always keep that in mind. Okay, this is a little inside baseball. This is something that I do. This is for a spin-off novel in the empowered world called Inspirited. And what I do is I actually keep track of, within the documents as a comments field, where my chapters are, how many words are in each of those chapters, so I know that I'm getting a decent balance and all that sort of thing. So I know in chapter 1, there's 2 parts to it, and the second part's a little lighter than the first part, but I'm still okay with that. And it's also good to be able to refresh, like, okay, well, this is kind of where all these things happen. Keep notes, whatever program you're using, if you're using Word, if you're using Pages, use the comments field to kind of tag where things are so that you know basically if it's feeling even or uneven, or where specific things happen. This is also useful for when you're like, oh, I know that this needs to happen, but I'm not in the right mindset to write that today. I'll write that later. So I'm just going to leave a note. Hey, big fight happens here. Or hey, big confrontation, big, whatever small thing happens here, but you can always tag that so that your future self can address that problem. And then in a separate document, I keep these sorts of notes. And I wanted to kind of give myself a little bit of a, hey, remember that this is your North Star. This is what the story feels like. This is where it dwells, contemporary fantasy, and then a little bit about the characters and a little bit about the story, and it's a tale of two origins. So I kind of have a North Star as to what I'm writing. And then I started to do a word tracker. Now, I don't know if this is going to be helpful for everybody, but it let me see like what I was doing in terms of words pacing, so I could see how far along the path I was. And I do the percentages out of 60,000 just to see how close I am to the finish line, because early on it's going to be a little daunting, but as you get closer, you're going to feel like you can see it, and that's always important. And then I also make sure that I note where I introduce specific characters in case I need to go back and see how I describe them, because sometimes you can get so involved in the process that someone could be a redhead in chapter 1 and a brunette in chapter 3 and a blonde in chapter 5. And you need to make sure that you have those details, because ultimately that's kind of important to have that consistency, but you also need to, make sure that that's not standing in the way of propelling your story forward. It's a terrible thing, I think, in life to wait until you're ready. I have this feeling now that actually no one is ever really ready to do anything. There's almost no such thing as ready. There is only now, and you may as well do it now. Generally speaking, now is as good a time as any. And that's supposed to be inspiration. And for those of you who are wondering, yes, Hugh Laurie did put out a book, so this does totally count as a writer giving you writing advice, although he's a hilarious comedian and actor as well, and a great drama actor too. But I think this is an important lesson, because now you have control of now. You no longer can impact yesterday, and you don't know what tomorrow is going to be. So now is really important to you. So the big thing to do is to have resources. You now know me. I'm out there in the interwebs, so you can find me out there. And there's also NaNoWriMo.org,